But if we're allowed to question those preferences, then we may discover that the information we used to come to our conclusions was faulty, and we may need to reconsider what we think we like. Alright, so I wanted to make a part 2 to the That's Just My Opinion video that I made a few weeks ago because I wanted to talk about the different types of opinions and how they contribute to the notion that opinions can't be wrong in the first place. Now, in case you haven't seen it, the purpose of that first video was just to establish the idea that, contrary to popular belief, opinions can in fact be wrong. But of course, there are different types of opinions. I think that part of the reason this notion that opinions can't be wrong developed in the first place is because we tend to only classify preferential beliefs as opinions. Statements like, "I like the color red," are easily identifiable as opinions, and rightly so, can't really objectively be proven wrong or right. If you like the color red, you like the color red. End of discussion. Well, at least for now. We'll come back to this idea later. But the belief that the Earth is flat or that the moon landing was faked are also statements that fall under the definition of opinion, which again is a view or judgment formed about something, not necessarily based in fact or knowledge. These types of statements aren't preferences, but they're still opinions. And so the popular belief that opinions can't be wrong also applies to these statements as well. And it's with these types of statements that my last video took issue. Because to tell someone that opinions can't be wrong only emboldens them to continue holding beliefs that directly contradict reality. And that's a world that I don't think any of us want to live in. But for this video, I wanted to focus on preferential opinions and ask the question, well, are these types of opinions also immune to scrutiny? Can these opinions also never be wrong? Because on the surface, the answer is no. These opinions can't be wrong. Going back to that example, if you like the color red, you like the color red. There is no wrong or right about it. But I would like to dig a little deeper because I do think that preferences, being a subcategory of opinions, can be wrong. And I also think we have to differentiate between innate preferences and learned preferences. But we'll get to that later. Okay, so like I just said, a preference is a subcategory of opinion. So in other words, a preference is always an opinion, but as we've already established, an opinion isn't always a preference. A preference, by definition, is a greater liking for one alternative over another or others. But opinions exist outside of having a greater liking for one thing over another. As we've already discussed, an opinion can just be a statement like, I think cereal should actually be classified as a soup. There is no inclination for one thing over another here. There is just a statement, albeit a disgusting one, and it is still classified as an opinion. Again, meaning that opinions exist outside of being preferences. But a preference, by definition, is always an opinion. Using the definition of opinions, a preference is a view or judgment formed about something compared to a view or judgment formed about something else. Now, the reason it's important to identify preferences as opinions is because by the nature of that fact, preferences are subject to the same fallibilities as opinions are. If a preference is a view or judgment formed about something, not necessarily based in fact or knowledge, compared to a view or judgment formed about something else, also not necessarily based in fact or knowledge, then it's possible that those views and judgments formed about the things being compared are inaccurate, and therefore the preference itself could be based on a false perception of those things. Take ice cream, for example. I may say that I have a preference for vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. And if we were to use the common perceptions around opinions, most people would say, well, that's your preference and there's nothing more to say about it. But I believe that there's plenty to question about that preference. Because what if my entire concept of chocolate ice cream is based on an incomplete understanding of what it actually is? What if the only chocolate ice cream I'd ever eaten was a single knockoff store-bought brand that was made in a foreign country where they used dark chocolate instead of milk chocolate? And so now that singular experience constitutes my entire perception of what chocolate ice cream is. Meanwhile, what if my perception of vanilla ice cream was based off of years worth of eating all kinds of different vanilla ice creams, from store-bought to gourmet? Now put this preference into context. Is this really a fair comparison? Can I really still say that I prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate ice cream, even though in this example it'd be fair to say that I'd never really experienced real chocolate ice cream? And so since my opinion of chocolate ice cream was based on a false perception of what it truly is, it's possible that if if I had a more complete understanding of the flavor, I may actually prefer chocolate ice cream to vanilla ice cream. And so in this case, the questioning of my preference led to the identification of a false perception. If preferences are never wrong, then that questioning never takes place and the discussion ends after a preference is stated. But if we're allowed to question those preferences, then we may discover that the information we used to come to our conclusions was faulty, and we may need to reconsider what we think we like. Now, I know that there's still no objectively right or wrong answer when it comes to these types of opinions. So technically, you could argue that these types of opinions, aka preferences, can't objectively be right or wrong. At the end of the day, vanilla isn't inherently better than chocolate or vice versa. But I think what truly matters here is the process of discovering what is right for you as an individual beyond the misconceptions and misinformation that may be clouding your judgment. In that sense, your preference could be objectively wrong for you. If we never question our or other people's preferences, then we may linger under the belief that a particular preference is right for us when it's not. And we will only continue to hurt ourselves seeking a preference that is actively detrimental to our well-being. Maybe this idea would be easier to understand if we took the discussion away from food and into a more contentious arena, like, let's say, dating. A common phrase people use a lot when asked about the type of person that they're seeking is, well, that's just my preference. And again, up until now, the discussion has had to just end right there. You like what you like and nothing more can be said. But again, I think the questioning can and should go further. Again, since a preference is just a subcategory of opinion, it's possible that the information used to arrive at that preference is based on a falsehood or misconception. And if it is, then you could be seeking a partner or personality type that is objectively bad for you. And so I think it's important to ask why you have those preferences. Hey, so my camera died and I ran out of light, so I'm filming this a couple days later, hence the changes in wardrobe and hair length. But now that that's all cleared up, back to the video. So for example, growing up, I was always more attracted to women with darker hair. I can vividly remember thinking to myself at some point that the woman I'm gonna marry is gonna have either brown or black hair. And so I would project that into my real life as I told myself and others that I prefer women with darker hair. But a couple of years ago, when I started thinking more seriously about all the things that I make videos about today, I started to think deeper about that preference and it all started to fall apart for me. I noticed that there were plenty of times that I felt an attraction to someone with red or blonde or any lighter shade of hair, and even though I didn't consciously dismiss the idea, subconsciously there was something blocking me from ever taking that person seriously as a potential partner. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to analyze the potential influences that I had as a kid. And I started to realize that this was all Liv Tyler's and Franka Potente's fault. And also probably Emma Watson too. But more specifically, the fault lay with the characters that they played. Arwen from The Lord of the Rings and Marie Kreutz from the Bourne trilogy. And obviously Hermione Granger. I've mentioned before how The Lord of the Rings is my favorite trilogy of all time. And I think I've talked about how the Bourne trilogy is also in my top 5. And literally every boy my age had a crush on Hermione Granger growing up. So that's self-explanatory. And I don't think I knew it at the time because I was so young, but looking back and really examining this strange preference, I think I subconsciously developed an attraction for darker haired women because of these women's portrayals of these characters. And this subconscious attraction had a very real effect on my life because I started to associate dark hair with the characteristics that I found attractive in those characters. But also, to be fair, it wasn't all their fault. I'm not proud to admit this, but I think part of the reason that I singled out blonde haired women in particular was because of the unfair stereotype that blondes were dumb. But fortunately for me, I just couldn't reconcile my preference for darker haired women with the sheer overwhelming number of vibrant, captivating women of varying hair colors that I've come across in my life. And eventually I got to the point where I really had to ask myself why I was so dead set on dark hair. And when I questioned my own preference, I realized that the information I used to come to that preference was based on a misconception. Hair color isn't always indicative of a personality type, and the traits that I was attracted to aren't limited to people with dark hair. And that's why I think there's value in questioning preferences, whether they're ours or other people's. I use myself as an example here, but if you look at the culture around dating today, I think it becomes clear why questioning preferences is important. There are a lot of arbitrary preferences that men and women place on each other that I personally believe would start to fall apart if they were seriously questioned and examined. And I think having these arbitrary preferences leaves us all in a worse position, as we're potentially seeking traits that are at best superficial and unnecessary, and at worst actually harmful to to us. Now, I do think that there are some preferences that will continue to ring true for us even upon further examination. Earlier, I mentioned that we need to differentiate between innate preferences and learned preferences, and this is what I meant. So for example, in another video, I talked about how I naturally gravitate towards fictional stories, or in other words, I prefer fictional stories to non-fictional ones. Now, at a certain point, this was simply an unexamined preference that I held that I didn't even know I had. But recently, I made a whole video about this preference in my attempt to deconstruct it. In the video, I explained how I questioned this preference and decided to engage with stories that I naturally tend to gravitate away from. And in so doing, I found that I also enjoy these stories as well, at least more than I thought I would. But even though my preconceived notion that I just don't like nonfiction stories was proven wrong, the underlying preference that I held for fictional stories still remained, even after this methodical and intentional questioning and examination of my preference. And so because of this, I would classify my inclination for fictional stories as an innate preference, or a preference that isn't derived from any outside influence. To put it into psychological terms using the nature versus nurture framework, my preference for fictional stories is a part of my nature. I wasn't nurtured into loving these stories, it's just a part of who I am. My preference for women with darker hair, however, was a learned preference. That was indicative of my nurturing. It's not an inherent part of my nature, but I was influenced into preferring it because some of the characters that I felt an attraction to shared that trait. And so I thought that this trait was an indicator for the type of person that I would be attracted to. And so dark hair over light hair and fiction over nonfiction are two preferences that I held. But it was only because I was allowed to question these preferences that I was able to draw a distinction between them and understand how they were influencing my life. And in the case of the learned preference, it turns out I was actively limiting myself and my potential pool of partners by having that preference. And I would still be limiting myself if I never questioned it. And in the end, that's why I believe it's so important to question all opinions, whether they're statements or preferences. Because regardless of the type of opinion, the information used to come to that belief could have been based on falsehood, misconception, undue influence, or even just flat out deceit. But in any case, I think that's going to be it for this one. If you made it this far, thank you for indulging me. I truly appreciate you watching, and I hope this made sense. As always, if it didn't, please feel free to let me know so that I can clear up any misunderstandings. But with that said, I wish you all the very best going forward. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.